In the 90s, the era of discoveries did not concern the taiga. During my 2 years of service in the Vitim Reserve, I came across 3 corpses. The first one froze to death due to his own foolishness, trying to get rich quick. The second one perished from the torment of conscience, consumed by his reckless actions. And the third one was not my discovery. He found me himself. With his appearance, it became clear to me that the taiga holds secrets that are better left undisturbed. I am Viktor Verkhaturov, 48 years old. My past and present are connected to this place, like those of my father and grandfather. We were hunters, operating under the same system, hunting sables, living in accordance with the laws of the wild nature. But the 90s changed everything. The hunting farm was closed, everything went awry. Some gave up, some went to the city in search of happiness. But I stayed. My home is my taiga. The decision to become a gamekeeper was a desperate step, a salvation of the last thing I had left from chaos and human greed. My plot is an inaccessible 400 square kilometers of wild land right in the heart of the reserve. The official name of the sector is Gloomy, but the locals call it Red River. It takes a week to reach the reserve administration by the river, weather permitting. There is no communication, only mountains, swamps, and endless taiga. People are a rarity here. Each encounter is an event, and not always a pleasant one. Here their own laws reign, and one can only trust their own gun. In late autumn, the taiga always falls silent, preparing for sleep. But that year the silence was different, tense, as if the earth sensed impending disaster. And it came to my plot. It happened in October '96, as I was walking along the stream in the farthest corner. Even for us, this place was secluded. The air already smelled of snow, and the ice crackled underfoot. The silence was so deep that it seemed one could hear a woodpecker from a kilometer away. And suddenly, I noticed something amiss. At the water's edge, a blue object stuck out from under the snow. Approaching closer, I immediately recognized it. City dweller. His lifeless body lay there, bent as if simply tired. The snow beneath him was undisturbed, indicating he had been lying there for a while. There were no signs of struggle or blood. He just grew tired and stopped. The taiga does not forgive such things. Digging through his pockets was not out of curiosity. There was almost nothing left in his backpack, except frozen bread and matches. But in his pocket, I found what led him here. In an old envelope from the 70s, already faded to a hole, soaked with moisture, there was a message. The water had blurred the inscriptions, but some words were still discernible. The only warning: do not trust anyone. And all of this was happening somewhere above the dry log. I squatted down, took a sip of fragrant tea from my flask. A warm breeze burned my face as I gazed at the mysterious stranger and pondered, "There's no point in discussing this find at the administration. I understand it's pointless and foolish. Pointless because no one here will retrieve it until spring. And foolish because for every official interested, 3 unconventional predators will come." I hid his map and letter in my pocket, covering the body with branches. Not humane, of course, but it's better than being torn apart by a beast. It's time to return to the outpost and figure out what to do with the secret that this person brought to my land. The road to the cabin took 6 hours of walking, and for the first time in many years, I felt a chill run down my spine, but it wasn't frost. Upon returning to the outpost, I immediately lit an old oil lamp. My only refuge always greeted me with the scent of fading smoke, resin, and dry grass. But this evening was so different. I took out a foreign map and a letter from my pocket and placed them on the table, illuminated by the uneven light of the lamp. These 2 pieces of paper, brought from afar, seemed to weigh down the air in my refuge. Now I couldn't calm down. The map turned out to be an old Soviet card, considerably grayed with time. The area was marked with pencil outlines, and I knew the terrain well. Hilly ridges, gloomy gorges, piles of rocks that could collapse at any moment. Locals avoided this place. The letter was almost dissolved by moisture, but I deciphered its meaning. It spoke of a secret related to an airplane. And suddenly, a fragment of my father's story, heard in childhood by the stove on a cold winter night, came to mind. It seems that in the 70s here, in the Pokatisti region, they were searching for a missing An-2 mail plane that disappeared from radars, and they never found it. There was a lot of talk about it back then, But then everyone forgot, as everything fades away that doesn't bring money or food. I looked at the map again. It wasn't just a fairy tale. Over the next few days, I scrutinized the area with doubled attention, studied the routes, examined the tracks, but most of all listened and searched not for animals, but for people. And on the third day, I found them. Not the people themselves, but their trail. In a damp ravine by Bear Creek, where the ground was not yet frozen over, I found clear tracks. The tread of the shoes, not local, resembled NATO boot prints. Two people burdened. It was evident from how deeply their heels dug into the ground, following each other, carefully avoiding obstacles. Professionals. I followed their trail for a kilometer until I reached their campsite. A fire smoldered in the hollow to avoid drawing attention, burning only dry olive wood. There was not a single trace of outsiders around. As they left, they even covered their departing tracks with soil. Except for two burnt-out casings from an SKS rifle that I found by the creek, one could think that there hadn't been any living souls here recently. Running my fingers over these barely noticeable tracks made me shudder. These people knew the area well and didn't come here for a simple reason. Their weapons were not meant for hunting. But a day later, I heard approaching footsteps. The northern wind brought me the ominous roar of a Buren snowmobile racing through the pass. This sound cut through the silence like a dirty rag. Immediately I realized these were outsiders. No local would waste gasoline and scare wild animals at this time of year. Following the traces of the aliens who left behind shards of young taiga, I realized that they were not following the usual paths. Their trail was boldly and persistently blazed, as if they were at home here. I didn't linger at their campsite. The place was permeated with disgust. Empty cans of food, cigarette packaging, a bottle of cheap vodka. Barbarians who believed that strength and aggression replace intelligence. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. Shaking my head slightly, I sat on a stump, took out my flask. The tea had long gone cold, but I still took a few sips. Everything became clear. The air above the old Anvam was filled with birds ready to disturb the peace. The nights became restless. My home turned into unfamiliar territory, and I had to act. Setting out to hunt for the plane, I would protect it from these two dishonorable strangers. Nothing should interfere with my plan. In the morning, while strength still lingered in the darkness, I packed provisions, a thermos in my backpack, and left, closing the door behind me. Making my way up the rocky slope and deliberately avoiding the usual paths, I walked towards the summit, observing everything below from a height. After 3 hours of continuous ascent up a steep slope, I reached the desired point. In the thin, bone-chilling air, I settled on a ledge, sheltered by rocks, took the old binoculars in my hands, and there, down in the valley, 800 meters away, lay the darkening skeleton of the plane. It had been lying there for almost 3 decades, buried in the ground, like a natural camouflage of the taiga, enveloped in the embrace of its trees. The sight was simultaneously impressive and intimidating, like the bones of an ancient beast perished far from the world's eyes. The descent took over an hour, every step accompanied by sliding on rocks and crumbling soil. I had to grab onto bare tree roots to maintain balance. Reaching the plane itself, I froze, listening intently to the surrounding silence. Only the wind whispered its mysterious words through the gaps in the damaged skin, as if an invisible presence exhaled from within. The air was filled with the smell of decay, rust, and dead metal. Mailbags, debris, pilots' remains. I decided not to disturb their peace and only touched the heavy metal box embedded in the cabin floor. The lock, corroded over the years, gave in after a few blows of the axe. My heart skipped a beat, but under the lid there was neither gold nor stacks of money. Instead, in airtight tubes, neatly wrapped rolls of geological maps and thick journals with detailed handwritten notes were found. On one of the sheets marked Top Secret, there was a plan of the richest polymetallic ore deposit, a real treasure that gained popularity not only through rumors, but through personal knowledge, a curse capable of turning wild mountain peaks into a ruthless quarry. And at that moment I heard them, hunters coming down the slope from above, branches cracking, muffled male voices, professionals, and immediately the crackling and cawing from below, from the makeshift camp, barbarians on their brown horses, coming for the loot and me. No time to think. I grabbed the tubes with maps, the most valuable and dangerous, and left everything else behind. The wind, like a harbinger of trouble, dragged down the slope where I fortified the birch bark and fire striker. The dry tinder served as perfect fuel. The clinking of steel, the glitter of sparks, and the dry birch bark burst into bright flames, at first uncertain, then intensified by the whirlwind of wind. The flames lay on the dry logs, spreading thick, resinous smoke along the ground, like a white river, filling the air with its sharp scent. Surprised exclamations, angry curses spread through the air. They were blinded and disoriented, and I, already retreating, followed a narrow path along the cliff that none of them dared to know. Leaving them in their inhuman struggle with fire and each other, I returned to the inhabited borders only the next day, making sure that no one was chasing me. Exhaustion completely engulfed me, but the long night by the blazing hearth made me contemplate. Before me lay the maps, mysterious and ruthless. I looked at the marked areas and numbers worth someone's life, capable of taking the lives of many more. This knowledge doomed me to wealth, trade, and following those who would come next, but I saw in the furnace fire the call of nature and understood that becoming one of them was not my choice. In one of the creepy old alcoves from which I decided to protect my estate, I set fire to the cards. The thick paper reluctantly tried to burn, wailing, contorting, and turning into ashes, along with the doomed cursed forest. I extinguished the lantern and settled down. The hut smelled of tranquility again, but I knew that this peace was artificial. I wiped the map, but could not erase the rumors and memories. The battle for silence was just beginning, but that's another story. November, in our regions, is a ghostly month, neither autumn nor winter. Snow would cover the ground with a thin blanket, then melt again, leaving the frozen, dull soil bare. Short days, gray, the taiga falls silent, gathering strength before the long frosts. In one of such gray weeks, I headed to the far western edge of my region, to the Sahotan Range. I needed to check the old salted places and fix the roof of one of the wintering spots before everything was covered in snow. I had been walking for the second day, and by noon had reached the top of the ridge, from where my region was visible as if in the palm of my hand. And then, scanning the familiar valleys and passes up to the last tree, I saw something unacceptable. From the forested valley where the Grouse River flowed, a thin, almost imperceptible stream of smoke rose. I froze, bringing the binoculars to my eyes. The smoke was coming exactly from where the old wintering of the state farm was located. The hut, where I myself had not been for 2 or even 3 years, I knew that the roof there was rotten and the stove was rudely smoked. And I was sure that none of the inspectors had any intentions of going in that direction until spring. My heart skipped a beat, and then began to beat evenly, as if on schedule. Curiosity in our line of work is a dangerous feeling, but a job is a job. I adjusted the straps of my backpack and changed direction. I didn't go straight towards the clearing. It was too risky. I turned a couple of kilometers to approach the winter camp from the windy side, walking through dense spruce forest that concealed sounds and scents. About a kilometer before the cabin, signs of their activity began to appear. A young, fresh tree was crudely chopped down, the bark rubbed off and splinters scattered in all directions. That's how someone acts who doesn't understand that good firewood requires sawdust, not live trees. Further on, a path led to a stream. Not just a path, but a whole road, trampled down to mud. I realized that this place was frequently used, with no attempt to hide it. A newcomer, or someone who didn't care about the wisdom of the taiga. I circled around the cabin widely. The door hung on one hinge. Lazy smoke lazily rose from the chimney. I found a comfortable spot among a pile of rocks 100 meters away, where the winter camp was clearly visible, and lay down. I took out a thermos, poured hot tea into the lid, and waited. Waiting was my skill. An hour passed, then another. The sun was already starting to tilt towards sunset when the cabin door creaked. A woman appeared at the threshold, thin and worn out, wearing some urban coat over a knitted sweater. She looked confused, dropped a bucket of trash right at her feet, and immediately disappeared inside. After a while, thick black smoke started to seep out of the chimney. Raw firewood was thrown into the stove, and then I heard a cough, weak, like a child's, but piercing. The sound came from inside, muffled but resonating clearly in the frosty air. Everything fell into place. It wasn't a gang of poachers or fugitives. It was a family of refugees from a world that cracked hundreds of kilometers away. The law had its clear instructions. However, seeing the shadow of a child flicker in the small, dim window of the winter camp, I felt a wavering in my stance on the law for the first time. It was evident that the conversation promised to be serious. I waited until dusk when darkness began to envelop everything before stepping off the cold stone. Without hiding like a thief, I, the ranger, the guardian of the law in these parts, emerged from behind the trees and headed towards the winter camp, striding in a way that left no chance of going unnoticed from afar. The snow crunched under my felt boots, breaking the evening silence, acting as the best warning. I knew they had already seen me, so I gave them time to prepare for the meeting. I ascended the porch without haste and knocked on the door with my fingers, loudly, confidently. Everything behind the door suddenly froze, but then there was a rustling, a muffled female voice, and an irritated whisper of a man. Finally, the door creaked open ajar, and in the narrow gap I saw the man, slender, with an uneven face and a piercing gaze. In his hands was an old single-barrel I-17 shotgun, a Berdan, as they called it here. The barrel was pointed downwards, but I noticed the white knuckles on the stock, ready to pull the trigger at any moment. Introducing myself formally as protocol dictated, I, Verkoturov, the state inspector, declared my affiliation with this area. I spoke calmly, keeping my hands visible, away from my rifle slung over my shoulder. The man remained silent, only staring at me intently. Then, without making any sudden movements, I explained to him the essence of the accusations, talked about the protected area, the illegal presence, and the need to draw up a protocol. Each word sounded decisive, as if I were reading out instructions, but inside, everything screamed in contradiction to what was happening. He smirked ironically at the mention of the protocol and began speaking harshly and loudly. It was not a conversation, but a pouring out of his soul, full of despair and bitter resentment towards the world. His words boiled down to a simple fact: they had nowhere else to go. He spoke of the closed factory in their settlement, months without work, of selling all their treasures just to feed their child. He asked, "Am I really the same man who sees no way out other than to perish here in the taiga, from hunger or a bullet, rather than return to a world that has already turned its back on us?" At that moment, a woman appeared because of him. Her face was pale from exhaustion, and her eyes burned with such universal fear that my heart clenched. She held a little girl wrapped in a blanket close to her. The girl coughed again, and that dry, sharp cough pierced the ears, rightly compared to the worst curse. In the dimly lit hut, smelling of dampness and illness, I saw an iron bed, bare walls, a black stove, and emptiness. There were no supplies, not a glimmer of hope. It became clear to me that before me were not criminals but people on the brink of survival. My speech, filled with legislation, did not fit here. It even seemed cruel. I tried to explain that the law is the law, that staying here, especially with a sick child, is dangerous. But even to myself, my words seemed artificial. I saw a glimmer of despair in his eyes, and he was already prepared for the worst. I fell silent. The pause stretched. In the surrounding silence, only the creak of the firewood in the stove and the barely noticeable breathing of the girl could be heard. Finally, I announced that I would return the next day, giving them time to think. I did not wait for a response, turned around and walked towards the exit of the hut, feeling two gazes on me, one filled with hatred, the other with wordless plea. I walked into the darkness, and at that moment, my work seemed less protective than before, rather a senseless, cruel obligation. The night promised to be long. The night at the outpost remained sleepless. I left the recess in the log cabin, sat down at the table, and rested my head on my hand, watching the light peeking out from under the kerosene lamp's soot. The same thoughts spun in my head like a broken record, bringing me back to the conversation of the evening. The law was on my side, transparent, concise, clearly outlined in the instructions. I even grabbed the tattered green folder with job responsibilities from the shelf. When encountering unauthorized individuals on the reserve's territory, it was necessary to take measures to exclude them and draw up a protocol. The words sounded cold, merciless, and did not resonate with the reflection of the menacing gaze of the man with a gun and his wife's frightened face. My work was based on these simple rules. It was the order that needed to be protected from the chaos of the 90s. And in order to maintain this order, I had to send the family with a sick child beyond the boundaries. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't my business, that I was just following the system's instructions. But before my eyes, there wasn't an image of a violator, but rather the image of a little girl wrapped in a blanket. The memory of my own daughter came to mind when she was 5 and fell ill with pneumonia one winter. I remembered that terrible fear that makes you willing to give up everything just to hear your child breathe evenly again. This image erased thoughts of duty and instructions from my mind, leaving only a painful sadness and a sense of helplessness. Meanwhile, outside, the wind was picking up. At first, it playfully whispered through the chimney, but by midnight it was howling like a beast, shaking the old pines on the outskirts of the village. A real blizzard had begun. The decision was now clear. No one could leave this place while the elements raged. Like a heavy burden lifted off my shoulders, a feeling of relief washed over me. The decision had been temporarily made. Maybe it's for the best, I thought. There will be time. But the taiga had its own opinion. It didn't give me a chance to delay. Around 2 in the night, in the midst of the storm, when it seemed like the house was about to be swept away, I suddenly heard a knock. It wasn't an ordinary knock, but rather a faint, desperate scraping drowned out by the roar of the wind. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Perhaps a branch was tapping against the wall. I froze, trying to make out the sound. The scraping repeated, this time louder, more insistent. I grabbed my rifle, approached the door, and shouted, "Who's there?" In response, there was only a muffled groan, immediately carried away by the wind. I removed the heavy bolt. The door suddenly swung open under the force of the wind, filling the room with a whirlwind of cold snow that, swirling around, engulfed the light from the lamp. Standing in the doorway, clinging to the frame, was a woman, Anna, the wife of the owner of the winter house. Snow covered her scarf and shoulders, her eyelashes frozen in a white crust, and her face was pale as a woolen blanket. She took a step inside and collapsed on the floor, completely exhausted. I pushed her inside, pressing against the door to drown out the storm's fury. In the darkness, I lit a lamp by touch, sat the woman on a bench near the stove, removed her icy scarf, poured hot tea from the thermos into a cup. Her hands were shaking so much that she struggled to hold the cup. I had to help her drink. She took a sip, started talking, feeling nauseous and interrupted. Her daughter was in a bad condition. She was burning up, breathing heavily as if someone was squeezing her chest. Alexei sat by the bed, indifferent and motionless, staring into emptiness. Overwhelmed with horror, she put on whatever she could find and headed into the storm towards me. Walking through memories for almost 3 hours, struggling through snowdrifts and losing her way on the brink of freezing. In that moment, all my doubts, all reflections on national duty in the system, seemed to evaporate. They disappeared instantly, like strong grass vanishing from sparks of flame. Before me stood not the wife of a lawbreaker, but simply a mother ready to die for her child. And now I had no choice. There was only a girl here who might not live until morning and a blizzard outside. I steeled myself, silently put on a warm coat, checked the first aid kit. A jar of bear fat, a tincture of bog bilberry. Only 1 pack of aspirin and streptocide left, a meager supply. But that was all I had. I grabbed a rifle, threw the backpack over my shoulders. "Show me the way," I said to the woman. My choice was made. We walked through the raging darkness. It was not just movement, it was a struggle. The wind knocked us down, threw wet snow in our faces, cutting our skin. Visibility was no more than an outstretched hand. I marched forward, almost feeling my way, recognizing familiar landmarks around me. There was the blurry, twisted tree bent by the wind. There was that big rock resembling a sleeping bear. Anna followed me, holding on to the backpack, stumbling and falling. Several times I had to support her. She was silent, and this silence was more terrifying than any scream. It was filled with fear, hope, and a mother's lament. I had no idea if we would make it. I couldn't know if it would be too late by the time we reached our destination. Anna, kneeling in the corner of the room, whispered prayers and curses. Alexei remained motionless, like a stone statue of paternal grief. Outside, a merciless blizzard raged, while inside this small cabin, 3 people who had forgotten about themselves were waging their hidden battle with death. And then, at dawn, the impossible happened. Something I had stopped believing in. The girl's breathing became steadier. She stopped tossing restlessly and sank into a peaceful sleep. Looking around, I touched her forehead. It was still warm, but no longer burning. The crisis was behind us. Exhaustion weighed on me like a leaden burden. I glanced out the window. The blizzard had subsided. Over the world covered in white snow, the pale winter sun rose. Alexei looked up at me, his eyes no longer holding any malice, only deep, silent gratitude. He stood up, poured hot water into 2 iron mugs, and silently handed one to me. We savored the hot water, understanding each other without words. We both knew that something impossible had happened that night. I stayed with them until midday, making sure the girl was getting better. Before leaving, I left almost everything I had on the table: aspirin, groats, salt, a can of stew. My unwavering supply was now more needed by them than by me. I taught Alexei how to properly prepare firewood and where to fish in winter. I spoke to him not as an inspector to an offender, but as an experienced lumberjack to a like-minded person. I told them they could stay there until spring, but until the first warmth, but not to see or hear from me again. It was an order. Returning along the glistening path after the blizzard, I saw only 2 sets of footprints, mine and the one Anna left during the night. Now these 2 trails intertwined so tightly that any ropes would seem unreliable next to them. I returned to my secluded cabin and sat down at the table. My notebook with my notes was in its usual place. In the incidents section, I was supposed to describe the events truthfully, but instead I simply closed the notebook. My report would be full of lies. I came to the taiga to follow its simple and honest laws. But that night I decided to break the natural order and submit to human rules. Now all this burden of responsibility and someone else's secret lay solely on me. Spring arrives slowly in our lands. It doesn't burst in with bright tropical greenery, but slowly and persistently pushes out winter. In April, the taiga looks scattered and exhausted. The snow melts, revealing last year's foliage. The mossy soil, soaked with melting snow, and the mud that doesn't dry for weeks. Rivers flood, carrying fallen trees and winter debris. The air is filled with the damp scent of earth, decaying wood, and the promise of new life. It's time for the gamekeeper to work hard. It's necessary to survey the area, assess the damage after winter, and check the condition of the wintering grounds. My path led to the most remote cabin on the plot, near a dry stream. It's an inconvenient place, poor in prey, so hunters avoided it. Even I rarely visited more than once a year. I was walking along the muddy path, constantly getting stuck in the mud. The birds had already returned. Their chirping filled the forest, but at times it was not joyful. In this spring bustle, there was something unsettling, as if nature was in a hurry to cover up with fresh leaves what remained after the long winter. I saw the winter shelter from afar and realized that something was wrong. The door, which was usually tightly closed and propped up from the outside with logs to prevent it from being snowed in, was now slightly ajar. It hung on one hinge and swayed lightly in the wind, sometimes revealing the dark space inside, then slamming shut again with a dull thud. This sound in the silence of the forest was the only sign of life, sending shivers down my spine. I took the gun off my shoulder and approached the cabin, trying to be silent. I peeked through the window, but due to the dirt and semi-darkness inside, I couldn't see anything. Then, after a moment of contemplation, I pushed the door with my shoulder. A heavy smell of alcohol, gunpowder, and something pungent and sweet hit my nose. Inside, there was complete chaos. A stool lay overturned on the floor, an empty vodka bottle on the table, a burnt-out candle in hardened wax, and a man. He sat at the table, resting his head on crossed arms, as if asleep, but in reality he had been sleeping for a long time. I recognized him as Stepan, a hunter from Zarechiye, an abandoned village 30 kilometers away. Under the table in the shadows, I noticed his double-barreled shotgun. Everything pointed to a drunken conflict that ended with a shot. In our region, this was a fairly common occurrence, but something bothered me. Hunters rarely go alone for winter prey. I stepped out of the cabin and began to carefully examine the surroundings. The snow had almost completely melted, but gray drifts still remained in the tree shadows. and on one of them I noticed old, worn-out tracks leading to the stream. I followed them, and 50 meters away from the winter shelter, I found Mikhail, Stepan's cousin. He had settled near an old deciduous tree, his back pressed against a tiny trunk, staring with glowing eyes at the mysterious water of the stream. All he had with him was an outdated sweater, no fur coat or warm hat. My attention slid over his figure. No trace of blood, no wounds. He was simply freezing from the cold. I stood near the bare trees, immersed in dampness, sadly shaking my head, looking at the frozen Mikhail, then at the place where his brother was coldly buried. There were only a few steps left to salvation, to warmth. But how to explain such a strange incident? Drunken, sharp quarrels did not reflect the reason why one died inside, and the other perished in the cold, practically at the door. This frightening sight made me anxious, and I felt that I would not calm down until I unraveled this tangle of mysteries and riddles that had dissolved here in the cold winter night. Stepping back into the little house, the scent of death and loss enveloped me even stronger, penetrating every cell. I needed to forget all expectations and just observe, as if I were in the taiga hunting for prey. I couldn't wish to see anything specific, just uncover the truth. My fingers found an abandoned double-barreled shotgun. It was old but gleamed with cleanliness. In one barrel there was a spent shell still smelling of gunpowder, and in the other a whole cartridge. So there was only one shot fired. Anticipating, I carefully placed the weapon in the corner and began a thorough inspection. Everything in the room indicated that someone had lived here for a whole winter. The shelves with grains and salt were almost empty. Bundles of dried mushrooms hung on the wall, and a tangle of traps sat in one corner. The men clearly had no intention of leaving until spring. But where was the result of their labor? A hunter who spent the winter in the wilderness must have caught something, especially such a valuable trophy as a sable. I felt every corner of the cabin, looked where others dared not, but found nothing. Deciding that I should look in Labas's box, a small storage on high piles where the game and supplies were usually kept. There was not a single pelt there either, and then the mysterious story of a drunken quarrel began to unravel like houses of cards. Two experienced hunters would not fight over the last bottle of vodka without significant reasons. They would argue to the death over the game, and since there was no game, it meant they didn't choose it. It was no longer just a strange murder, but a robbery. However, by whom and for what reason did it all look so strange? Why did the robber leave the gun but take the pelts? And what made Mikhail freeze just steps away from the door to safety? I sat down on the steps, took out my tobacco pouch from my pocket, and lit up. Bitter smoke surrounded me, and thoughts swirled in my head. It would take me 3 days to reach the nearest district center, where the weary lieutenant resided, and that too through the lurking spring thaw. I was afraid to imagine how I would get there and write the report. The tired local police officer, hiding from drunken brawls and complaints, would accept my story, mull it over, open a case, and bury it in the farthest corner. No investigative team would be sent here by helicopter for 2 dead poachers from a remote village. The case would be deemed an accident, and soon everyone would forget, and I would carry the worry with me. On one hand, it was not my business. My duty was to protect the forest from people, not to conduct investigations to understand how one person destroyed another. But on the other hand, it happened on my territory, in my remote forests, and if I stayed silent, pretending I didn't see anything, how would I differ from that local officer? The taiga wilderness is unfriendly to chaos. It has its own laws where death is a common occurrence. But death due to human greed is filth that requires immediate cleanup. The decision presented itself. I am not a tracker, but I am responsible for seeking the truth, if only for my own understanding of the plague lurking on my territory. I returned to the shelter, securely locking the door, propping it with a log. That was the most I could do for those who had departed to another world. The path led to the mouth of the river. It was necessary to look the living in the eye to unravel the mystery of why these friends had left. The journey to the settlement took almost a day. I walked without stopping, with the grim landscape swirling before my eyes. One brother was killed by a bullet, the other froze to death, and between them lay a silent, terrible mystery. The next day after lunch, I reached the estuary. This place had long ceased to be called by its former name. In reality, it was a slow decline. Houses with murky windows crowded closely along the street, filled with empty huts with collapsed roofs and broken windows. The only road was flooded with mud. By an old column stood a lonely old woman, her gaze as gloomy as the windows of her dwelling. There were no celebrations for welcoming guests here, especially in uniform. There had long been no place for joy here. The only sign of life was the trough, a low structure with bars on the windows. I entered inside, and the air smelled of cheap tobacco, dampness, and sour bread. Behind the counter sat a plump woman whose face always expressed universal exhaustion. I bought bread and salt. Starting a conversation turned out to be too easy. I mentioned that I had wandered along the dry creek and inquired about the fate of the hunters Stepan and Mikhail. The saleswoman hesitated, arranging identical canned jars on the shelf. Then, without meeting my gaze, she said that one brother disappeared in November, and no one had seen him since. I asked if they were expecting them in the spring. She just shrugged. According to her, Stepan, before leaving, loudly proclaimed in the shop that he was going to attack Sobolevsky district and return with wealth to buy a house in the city. No one, of course, believed him. Stepan was always big on words, but weak in action. And Mikhail? She barely mentioned him, as if he didn't exist. I felt she knew more, but intruding into their souls was futile. They lived in isolation and didn't allow outsiders. I left the shop and sat on the porch to smoke. The landscape was becoming clearer, but not entirely. The motive was the desire for a big catch, or ultimately belief in it. At the other end of the street, on the porch of his house, sat Grandpa Ignat, a seasoned local resident. I remembered him from my school years. He was the only one who greeted me when I entered the settlement. I approached him. Grandpa Ignat loved to chat. He told me more about the brothers than the entire village combined. He confirmed that Stepan was a hot-tempered man, striving for wealth and fame. Mikhail, his absolute opposite, always remained in the shadows, sheltered from the caring brothers' spotlight. And then one day, the old sage revealed the veil of mystery. Before their departure to the snow-covered forests of Zarechye, a mysterious stranger appeared on an elegant car adorned with the finest details. Grandpa called him a capitalist. He bought furs, generously rewarding for them, without asking unnecessary questions. Several times he was seen in the company of Stepan, with whom he secretly arranged business clashes near the shop. After these encounters, Stepan began spreading rumors about giant wealth awaiting him in the forests. And as soon as the brothers went hunting, the capitalist disappeared from the village. I expressed gratitude to the old man and headed down the dirty alley. The picture gradually unfolded before me. Two brothers, a dream of millions fueled by empty buyers. This buyer could have followed them to snatch the goods and deceive the hunters. Then everything started falling into place. He killed Stepan, taking the furs, and Mikhail, engulfed in panic, ran away. It seemed like a logical, simple solution, but something in this scenario still troubled me, some bizarre element that eluded my attention. And there remained the sole witness who could reveal the truth. Stepan's wife, Maria, living in the most remote corner, where the most difficult conversation awaited me. I knocked. Maria herself greeted me, panic reflected in her eyes, her face contorted in a grimace of exaggerated grief. She raised her hands in greeting, inviting me into the house, where the smell of freshly washed floors prevailed, as if at a real celebration. Pies were baking. I sat on the bench, declining the tea. In a serious tone, I reported to her what, it seemed to me, she already suspected. I told her how I found the winter shelter, discovered the bodies of her husband and brother. She listened, hiding her face in her hands. Her shoulders trembled from silent cries. But I saw not so much grief as elaborate improvisation. I noticed new boots by the stove, bright fabric on the table. In this poor village, it was a treasure no less than a gold bar. I waited for the first wave of grief to subside and then began. Calmly, without a fit. I revealed the topic of the mysterious death, noting the absence of fur in the winter shelter, which should have been there. I told her that the old man Ignat saw her husband in the company of a mysterious buyer. With each word, her crying became quieter. When I mentioned the word buyer, she froze and stared into my eyes for a moment. There was no longer grief in her gaze, only primal, animalistic fear. and then I understood that I had found the right direction. She remained silent for a long time, staring at me, then suddenly started talking. Quickly, nervously, as if afraid that if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to continue. It was no longer a conversation, but a confession, and the truth turned out to be much more dreadful and tragic than I could have imagined. The buyer indeed existed. He paid Stepan a huge sum. These money drove her husband to madness. He came up with a plan, as simple as ABC. Wait for the messenger to arrive for the main order of furskins, deal with him, take all the money, then get rid of Mikhail, a complex and fearful witness who no one would believe anyway. Maria was aware of the plan. She begged her husband to reconsider, but fear of him overcame the inner voice of conscience. Everything unfolded according to his plan. He killed the messenger when he arrived at the hut. Then he loaded the body along with the sled into the peat bog, a couple of kilometers away from the cabin. After that, he and Stepan sat down to celebrate the successful deal. But when they had drunk vodka and felt impunity, Stepan suddenly raised the gun at his brother. However, he had not taken one thing into account: Mikhail, who had been calm and reserved all his life. At that moment, when two death weapons were pointed at him for the first time in his life, he couldn't control himself. He lunged at his brother. During the drunken brawl, entangled in the carpet, they fought for the gun, and it went off spasmodically. Barely coming to his senses from the ringing in his ears, Mikhail found that Stepan was already dead. He forgot how he ran out of the hut, without a hat, without a warm coat. He was just running away from the horror of his own actions. Reaching the stream, he sat under the larch tree and never got up again. Maria froze in stillness. Sincere, bitter tears rolled down her exhausted face. Now I saw before me not an actress, but an unhappy, weak woman trapped by the greed of others. She looked at me, awaiting a verdict. I stood up. With a trembling voice, she asked what to do next. I hesitated, staring intently into the darkness of the black window. I simply said that I would report to the authorities about the bodies they had found. I left her hut without looking back. I headed back to my taiga, and with each step, the weight of this hideous secret seemed to seep into the ground. What should I have done? Reveal the truth? Then an investigation would start. Strangers would come, dig up the bog, find a third victim, and condemn this unfortunate woman who may have children. It wouldn't bring back the deceased. It would only bring new pain to the living. My report will note what everyone will already understand: an accident, a drunken quarrel. Let the taiga keep the true truth. It knows how to keep secrets. Sometimes justice lies not in dragging disputes out of the hut, but in leaving them where they originated. Many years have passed. The 90s are over, new times have come, but here in the taiga, time flows in its own way. It is measured not by calendar days, but by the change of seasons, the first snow and the last ice on the river. Now, walking through my plot, I understand that it has changed. Not externally, the same hills, streams, and bogs. It has changed for me. Now every corner holds its own secret, known only to me in my lifetime. Here, at the edge of the hills under the moss cover, lay the cards that could have cost a life. There, at the bends of a secluded stream, a family once stopped and departed to other worlds, leaving only quiet gratitude in my heart. And at the shore, covered with spring grass, a secret is long buried, where human greed consumed itself. I came here to Jaeger to exist by the laws of nature and to protect the taiga from humanity. But over time, I realized that my calling is connected to something else. To protect some from others, sometimes you have to protect them from themselves. The law, it is a fictitious creature, existing only on paper there, in the city. Here, across vast expanses spanning hundreds of kilometers, only your conscience reigns. It is your judge and executor of sentences. I adjust the aim of the gun and continue on the path of my mission. Around me stretches a silent emptiness, and I become its guardian.